Boy Scouts of America, this story is so insane. Now accused of covering up sexual abuse going back decades, the Los Angeles Times has gotten a hold of hundreds of documents that detail allegations against Boy Scout personnel and volunteers, and the files appear to show a pattern of protecting the accused and even sweeping it under the rug. Let's bring in one of the reporters on this story for the LA Times. Jason Felch is with us this morning. Jason, it's nice to talk to you. This is so shocking. 1,600 confidential files is what you had a chance to look at between 1970 and 1991. Explain to me where they were kept and how they were found and how you got access to them.
For the last 100 years, the Boy Scouts have kept these files confidentially in national headquarters, which now is in Irving, Texas. They've never been released publicly, but they have started to come out through civil litigation. So the files that we looked at came out in a 1992 civil case in California, and there are thousands more that have never been released.
So of those 1,600 cases, 500 of them were allegations that came from tips from people within the Boy Scouts. For example, some Boy Scouts themselves, sometimes the parents, sometimes people who are working for the Boy Scouts, sometimes an anonymous tip. Of those 500, how many times did the Boy Scouts say, let's call the police and investigate this alleged sex abuse on children?
Not as often as you'd hope. We found that in 80% of the cases where they were the first to learn about the abuse, there was no indication in the file that they actually called the police. In 100 of those cases, we actually found clear indications that there were efforts to cover up the abuse, keep it from parents, keep it from the public, keep it out of the press.
How would they do that? Give me some details on that. So if someone was suspected of child abuse, if they were suspected of child abuse or even serial child abuse, how would they cover it up?
Well, one of the most common ways was that they would catch the alleged perpetrator, one of the scoutmasters, having sexual relations with one of the boys, and instead of turning him into police, they would ask him to resign, and they would actually help him write a letter to parents explaining his departure in some other way. So we saw excuses ranging from chronic brain disease to duties at a Shakespeare festival, explaining why these alleged molesters were actually leaving the Boy Scouts. The truth was they were leaving because they had been caught.
You tell the story of a guy named Art Humphreys who was working with the Boy Scouts in the late 1970s through the 1980s. And even though he was accused by a 12-year-old boy of sexual assault, basically, they went on not only to keep him on, but also write a letter of recommendation. I'm going to read a little bit of that letter, and then I want you to tell me what happened to Mr. Humphreys. It says this: I'm attaching a Jamboree application for Mr. Art Humphreys. I believe the attached letters of recommendation and the newspaper write-up will give you a well-rounded picture of Art. If selected, I'm sure he would add much to the Handicapped Awareness Trail at the 1981 Jamboree. And this was written by a council executive for a guy who they knew had accusations against him by a young boy. What happened to him?
That's right. Mr. Humphreys continued to work in the Scouts despite their knowledge of his pattern of sexual abuse until he was arrested in 1984. When he was arrested, he eventually pled guilty to sodomizing 20 boys. And what never came to light in the trial was the fact that the Boy Scouts had known. In fact, when the Boy Scout official in charge of Art Humphreys' troop was asked by the press, did the Boy Scouts have any knowledge of Mr. Humphreys' behavior? He said no. What the Boy Scout confidential files reveal is that, in fact, they had known since 1978 that Mr. Humphreys was molesting children.
So the Scouts today have released a statement, and it says this: in the more than 100 years that the BSA, the Boy Scouts of America, serve youth, society has learned about this important issue. The BSA continuously enhanced its multi-tiered policies and procedures, which now include background checks, comprehensive training programs, and safety policies. That's from the spokesperson from the Boy Scouts of America. They released that on Sunday. So does that mean that the problems that existed, it sounds like they're saying those were problems back then, those problems don't exist today?
These files are, for the most part, 30 or 40 years old. And since that time, the Boy Scouts have changed a lot of their policies about how they protect children in the organization. The question is, and the question we don't know the answer to, is, are those policies working? The Boy Scouts continue to keep a confidential perversion file. They continue to keep records of sexual abuse in the organization, but those have never been reviewed by an outside entity, by an independent auditor. And in fact, they've never been reviewed by the Boy Scouts of America to see what's working and what's not.
And they've also been aggressively in court keeping these old files from being released, correct?
That's right. There's ongoing litigation today in several different places with victims of sexual abuse suing the Boy Scouts and demanding that these files be released in an effort to establish that there was a pattern of neglect here. And the Boy Scouts has fought in court to prevent those files from being released.
Clearly, there's going to be much more about that as more of these files come out. Jason Felch is a reporter with the LA Times. This is a fascinating article. Thank you for talking with us, Jason. We appreciate it.
Thanks, Soledad.
You bet. So ahead this